session right now for the child and adolescent counseling and counseling theory and application. So I will turn it over to our wonderful panelists who are currently here. We may have one or two more jumping in throughout the session. If we do, great. We appreciate your flexibility. So Dr. Erickson, we'll start with you.
Well, hello, everyone. I am faculty at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, and my experience is first as a school counselor, and then I moved into my private practice and teaching in higher ed. I'm in Colorado, and nice to meet you all today.
And Dr. Moore?
Hi, I'm Dr. Ruth Oots-Moore. I live in Savannah, Georgia. I'm full-time faculty with the clinical mental health counseling program at the Chicago School. And my area of specialty is counseling children and adolescents who've experienced abuse and trauma, but I work with families and couples and all populations, but a lot of work in that area with a subspecialty and working with preschool age children who've experienced abuse and trauma. And it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And Dr. Clark?
Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Corey Clark. I am also full-time faculty with the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Program. We're here with Chicago School. And yeah, I'm excited to be here. I've had a little bit of a different situation here. I was going to show around my counseling office because I have so many child counseling related materials. And our office got flooded today, like massive pipe burst flood. So a lot of things are like underwater. So I have to call an audible and be in a random conference room right now. But I am excited to talk about what makes child counseling unique. My background is in, I obviously specialize in child and adolescent counseling, but my research background is also around what makes child counseling different than counseling in adults, and how we must not treat counseling like we're counseling little adults, because kids are not just little adults in the counseling realm. They're separate and distinct in how we do counseling. So very passionate about that idea and what makes this subfield distinct. So I'm happy to be here.
Well, great. Thank you. Sorry for your circumstances. And again, practice flexibility. Appreciate it. So Dr. Erickson, I know you have a slide. If you want to put that up, please feel free.
It's just an introduction slide. It doesn't say anything, but if you want to see it, I can.
No, that's fine. No.
Okay.
I was thinking if you could, each one of you, and Dr. Erickson, I'll start with you because I'm looking at you right now. But if you can kind of talk about your the population you work with and some theory and then application, we can all share. You can then tag one of your two panelists to follow you, and then maybe provide a case study or just let us know how you work with peers.
Sure. Okay, great. Thank you, Colleen. The population that I work with are at-risk youth that are court mandated to see me, and I can give you a little backstory on that. As I shared in my introduction, I first worked as a school counselor. And in doing so, of course, we worked with at-risk youth, and we saw some getting expelled. There were some that were truant. We dealt with many different issues. And so as a result of that, we became quite close in working with the probation officers, diversion officers, and the judges in our area. And I'm in Colorado, so that would be Boulder County. In any case, so as a result of that, we started to see some common themes in our area, which were we had a lot of gangs. There was a lot of juvenile delinquency and a lot of truancy. So as a result of that, that's sort of where my specialty came, working with at-risk youth. After I left the schools, then I continued to get these referrals from the courts, which I continue to receive today. So I can talk about that aspect of it, and any questions that you have, I could pause to take them. But even still, I can share with you an example of a situation where I had with a student that was at risk. And this is a simple case, and then the theory that we used. Within our school system, there were students that weren't, how would I say, they weren't performing well academically. And so this one student in particular decided that she did not want to take her tests anymore, and decided to go into the bathroom and start a fire in the trash can because she did not want to take her test. Well, starting the fire, of course, we were all alarmed. We had to leave the building, and then you all know what happened. She was suspended. So I needed to see her. So as we started to see each other in session, we learned a few things. We learned that there were some issues at home that she had not disclosed, which she eventually did. One was that she was pregnant, but did not want her parents to know. The other was that there was violence in the home. And so that's where our work began. So for me, I am a reality theorist. I typically like to use reality because it's nice and neat. And so that's where we started. So what did she want? We know that she wanted to not have to take her tests. She didn't want to tell her parents that she was pregnant, and she didn't want to be in school. So as a result, we worked through her issue of first pregnancy. What did we do there? We had to assess for safety. Who in her family could she trust to disclose this? She determined that it was not her family, that it would be her aunt. And so we worked out a plan for her to share with her aunt. She first wrote a letter to me, and then she included her aunt in the session with me when she disclosed. That was well received, but she was worried about the reaction of her parents. So we worked on that and developed a safety plan. Next, for her pregnancy, she was a minor. However, she didn't have to disclose to her parents. But when I see that in working with minors, I have the student share with me, their concerns, and I let them know that it really is important at some point that they disclose this to their parents or their guardians or their caregivers. And so she did disclose after 5 weeks of us working together to make sure that she was getting the care that she needed. Then, because she was expelled from school, she had to attend many different group sessions, classes within the court. She had to also attend restorative justice, which was important for her, so she could apologize to those that she harmed in the school as a result. I mean, it was a year-long process before she was able to go back to school. And so these are the type of cases that I get. And I'm going to pause here to see if there are any questions about this particular case.
Dr. Erickson, I'd love to hear more about like this idea of working with parents in situations. I think that's one of the hardest parts of this work is remembering who's the client, right? And
Yeah.
what, and yeah, I see someone in chat is kind of working with minors with consent of parents. Some states you need consent of both parents. Some states you need consent of one or one caregiver. So yeah, I think talking a little bit more about that, it's very complex.
It is complex. And you make a great point, because the parents do have to consent to the therapy. And then also with the parents, these particular parents didn't have major concerns that they wanted to know. Sometimes parents will share with me, well, when they talk about this, we need to know. So when that happens, I discuss the principles of confidentiality and what that means to their child and the success of our sessions. But in this particular case, she was mandated for counseling with me, number one, and number two, her parents already knew that. As far as the pregnancy, she did not have to disclose because she was at an age of consent, so she didn't have to disclose that. But again, Dr. Clark, I think it's important that the parents be involved because they are minors. But through our counseling sessions, I didn't tell her she needed to, but we were able to come to the decision that disclosing to her parents was important. But she wasn't ready yet because she needed to have a safe place to go when she disclosed to them, because she was afraid her dad would kick her out. She was afraid. So the parents did sign off on therapy. They did not request anything from me. We did review all of the informed consent, and so they were on board. But this was a situation where there were a cultural considerations, because the family, they were a Hispanic family and felt as though the courts were making the right decision. And they deferred to me as their counselor, and yet I kept them involved throughout the process with the consent of my client. So any discussions that we had, the client usually was present with me and their parents to make sure that we were on board. And when the client did want to disclose to their parent, I was with the client. Did that help, Dr. Clark?
Absolutely. I just think, and Dr. Usmore, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. And this idea, we have to walk a tightrope. And I even say this at like the intake first session with a family, is I walk this line of maintaining the trust of this child or this teenager, that what they say to me in a room with maybe without a caregiver stays in that room, yes. Right? But I also make sure that parents, the number one complaint I get from parents who have taken their child elsewhere and they're bringing them to me is, I had no idea what my child's therapist was doing. Like, they just went back into the office, and now I'm like, what are the goals? What are they doing? What are they like? It feels pointless. And so we have to involve parents, right? Kids operate in a system. We have to make sure that we involve them, but not too much to where the child feels like it's just adults versus me, right? And so it's really hard to maintain that.
Well, and I do a lot of work with court families and children with court involvement. So I do a lot of work with, like I said, abuse and trauma, but also with high conflict divorce. And so another area of specialty of mine is training counselors in expert witness and courtroom testimony, because when I first started doing this work, if you work with children pretty much, but if you work with children who have parents that divorce, you're going to end up in court. If they experience abuse, there's going to be some type of court involvement, whether that's family and children's services, whether that is maybe this is a case where it's mom and dad are divorced and there's a custody dispute, but then there are allegations of abuse, and there wasn't enough information for a criminal trial or criminal case or indictment with grand jury. So then it becomes a custody matter, and these cases can get really complicated. So then you get a lot of multidisciplinary collaboration. So this child may have a guardian ad litem. This child may have a counselor. The parents may have counselors and attorneys, and before you know it, it can be like too many cooks spoil the broth kind of thing. And so it really is important that sometimes it gets very sticky, because like with what Dr. Erickson and Dr. Clark were saying, is that we walk a tight line, because it varies from state to state what the age of consent for treatment is. So if you have, let's say, a 16-year-old and you're working with in one state, they may have the right to full confidentiality with no parental involvement. But some states it's 18, and if they're 17, it doesn't matter. Then when you've got Child and Family Protective Services involvement, it's like, well, if the child's been removed, do the parents have any rights to that information? So it's a lot of thinking that you have to do in addition of logistics before you even can handle, like, what am I doing with this kid that comes in here with all of these issues, like with the case that Dr. Erickson gave. So I think that, can make it really complex, but it is figuring out, like with Dr. Clark, and saying, okay, but I do want my adolescents or children that I work with I want to try to respect that confidentiality as much as I can. It reminds me of a teenager that I worked with once, and she was suicidal. And so I told her, I was like, we've got an obligation, your parents need to know that this is going on and that you're suicidal. And so I gave her the option, either she could meet with me with the parents, or I would meet with the parents, but she could tell me what she wanted me to say. And she said, I don't want you to say I'm suicidal. And I said, okay, what if I said that you are preoccupied with thoughts of death? She's like, what's that mean? And I said, well, it means you think about it all the time, to the point you're writing poems about it. You're drawing pictures of how you would do it. You're thinking about how you're doing it. So, and she was like, oh yeah, you can say that. And what if I say that you're thinking about it so much that it's really concerning me that at some point you could get to a place that you might act on it, even though you're not at that place today? Oh yeah, you can say all that. You can say anything you want. I just don't want you to say I'm suicidal. So she did not like that word, but I said everything. I could disclose everything that she said, but it was helping her to feel empowered while still recognizing that parents had a right for information, and that I had an ethical obligation to inform the parents.
Yeah, I've been in very similar, very difficult situations where I had a teenager tell me, if you tell my parents, it will make me more suicidal. And I'm like, okay. And they decided to tell me that later in the session. So we didn't even have much time left. I'm like, you really put me in a corner where
the 5-minute mark.
yeah, the what's it called, where you have the doorknob kind of question comment at the end of the session. And it goes back to like the basics of like, okay, I can't end the session and let you walk out of here, right? Telling me that, right? And so let's take that option off the table, but there's a lot of things we can do here. So let's collaborate on this. And that was one of those sessions where I moved my following session. Like, it was one of those rare cases where like, nope, can't just move on. We're not just ending this session right now, right? We're gonna move things around and continue this. And eventually we were able to get to a point where that person was able to talk through and empower them to talk with their parents, but in a way that I was kind of a mediator to help that conversation go safely. But it was not easy. Sometimes the person you have to tell when there's a safety concern is the last person that's going to be supportive of that, right? And it makes it that much harder in sessions. It's very complicated. But the last thing we do is sit on it and say, well, I can't tell them because they don't like their parents, So knowing that's one thing I didn't realize going into this work is working with parents in the legal system. Right. I'm a former preschool teacher. I'm like, I love kids, working with kids. I was just like, let me just work with kids. Like, that's my jam. But then I worked with high conflict divorce and working with subpoenas and going into parents who are triangulating me and saying, tell them this, or counseling is pointless. Like all these things that I'm like, if I could just have the session be me with a child, like I'm good to go. But it's so much more than that. And I especially to those thinking about going out into this field with working with kids, like that's really important to consider and get training in and really think about, is like those outside of the session things when working with kids are so collaborative. We cannot operate in silos as child and adolescent therapists. That's, where I stand on it.
I agree with that. And it's interesting too, because I find that the dynamics are much different in working with adolescents than they are in working with young children. So I do a lot of work with in play therapy. So when I'm working with young children, I'm very child-centered, which is basically person-centered. And Dr. Clark recommended in the chat the book Play Therapy, The Art of the Relationship by Dr. Gary Landreth. And it's an easy read, but that's a lot of what I do with young children. And the premise behind that is play is children's language, toys are children's words. And so when they come into the playroom and they're punching a punching bag, I don't say you're punching the punching bag. I say, wow, looks like you're really frustrated. Oh, wow, it seems like it feels good to get that out. You don't label things like, oh, you picked up the toy teapot, because that teapot might be a plant waterer, or oh, you picked up a block. Well, that block might be a weapon, so you're letting them give you their words for that. And so when I work with parents, I work from an Adlerian standpoint, particularly in understanding the purpose of the child's behavior. And I've got a presentation tomorrow that'll talk more about those concepts. When I work with children, they're little older children and adolescents, I use a lot of props and creative measures, but a lot of structured play therapy techniques. But with the young children, I do, because they have limited cognitive and verbal abilities. And I've worked with children in play therapy as young as 18 months who've been abused, that don't have words. And one of the ones that stands out to me was a 4-year-old that I worked with. The dad brought him in, who had been estranged from this child because he and the mother were never married, and the mother got involved with someone else and would never allow him to see the child. And he didn't have financial resources to try to fight it in court, so he didn't have any contact with this child. Well, the mother was killed by her boyfriend, was shot and killed by her boyfriend, and then he killed himself. But it was in the middle of the night. And I guess he woke up and heard the fighting and came downstairs and walked into the room and saw him kill the mother. And so he goes upstairs to try to wake up his 12-year-old brother, who was his half brother. But anyway, they brought him to therapy because the police were like, we don't really know what happened, and one, he needs counseling, but we're not sure of the events. So he came in and immediately, and this book will tell you all about it, but there's categories of toys. There are aggressive toys, there are different types of toys. And he came in and he was immediately drawn to the aggressive toys, and he picked up a gun. And I mean, he didn't say anything. I'm like, hi, he came in and he walked over and he said, the gun, the gun, the gun, the gun, the gun, the gun, the blood, the blood, the gun, the gun. Oh no, oh no, oh, the gun, the gun. Mama dead, wake up, brother, wake up, brother, wake up, brother. Brother dead, brother dead, brother dead, brother dead. And he goes back downstairs and he chants this out, and he comes back upstairs, and then he says, whatever the man's name was that killed himself, he dead. Go back up. Brother not dead, brother not dead, brother not dead. So his brother was not dead. His brother was asleep, and he had trouble waking him up. But we were able to piece together what that experience was like for him through the course of the evening. And he never sat down and said, well, this is what happened. My mother, it was all, but from such a heavy trauma perspective of, and being able to come into a playroom in a safe space and to be able to work through those emotions. So there are things that you can do. There are things that kids do in the playroom that I don't even understand. Like, it might not make sense to me, but if they're repeating it, it means it's significant to them. There's something symbolic about this to them. And it's a really fascinating approach and a really fascinating thing to see happen, but also rewarding for us as counselors, but also in seeing the children who become empowered and are able to work through that trauma.
I want to add a little bit that like when I first started, I was like really nervous because I thought, well, I'm not a play therapist yet, so I can't work with kids, right? And I want to kind of just throw out there this idea that it's one thing to like not know anything about play therapy and then go see children, right? Wouldn't advise that. It's another thing to wait until like this idea that you have to be fully registered in RPT to see any children, right? I think it's really important to read that book, read and get into the literature about it and understand the difference between playing Uno and having play therapy materials in your room, right? We have to know the basic foundations, I think, of play therapy to work with young kids, a 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old, but and get supervision, to work with kids and work with people who know what they're doing there. But I dismissed the idea of me being able to work with kids and early on because I'm like, I'm not an RPT yet, right? And I can't do that. So I just want to throw that out there.
Well, and Dr. Clark, I think that's a great point because, you and I both are really, you more so than me in the Association for Child and Adolescent Counseling, which is a division of ACA. I've been very involved with the Association for Play Therapy, but I'm also really, really involved with the Association of Creativity and Counseling. And so the Association for Creativity and Counseling came along because we wanted Dr. Thelma Duffy, who was the creator, what's the word I'm looking for, founder of the division, but she wanted a place where counselors with whatever creative identity could come together and it not be like, oh, you're not a play therapist, you can't do that. Oh, you're not an art therapist, you can't do that. Oh, you're not a this, you can't do that. And where you can. And like Dr. Clark said, it doesn't mean you're going to go in there and be like, oh, hey, I've got toys and I'm going to call it therapy. You want to have training, you can go to conferences, but it doesn't have to be play therapy specific. It can be creative counseling specific or child.
Absolutely. Some of the best child counselors I've met would consider themselves more creative counselors, right? And use a lot of art therapy. And so that's, I use a lot of improv with my tweens and teens, and that's incredibly powerful for social anxiety, for getting out of your head and applying a lot of like DBT oriented concepts. I will say as like one thing that's important for me, as sort of a case example-ish, I didn't realize until, a little bit into my work with kids and teens, how important the room is, the environment is, right? I started out with like, give me Uno and Jenga and like some room on the floor to get down and play, and that's good. How you set up your room for a 5-year-old client is incredibly important, right? If you have structured games like Uno and Jenga and Monopoly, and that takes way too long, not Monopoly, but whatever, sorry, they're going to just sit down and play a board game with you, and that will be the session, right? And I realized early on, like, man, I'm spending a lot of time doing these games and I'm not really using the language of how, play in sessions. And so I read that book and I've gone to trainings and I've really dug into what the environment needs to be to allow for children to communicate in a variety of ways. So now I have an easel for people to communicate through drawing or painting or art. Now I have a beanbag with some more aggressive oriented toys. I have a bop it kind of guy that you can punch across the room if you need to. I've got a sand tray with minifigures. I've got books for bibliotherapy, that my go-tos for trauma and anxiety and whatever. And it allows a 5-year-old to walk in and be like, what can I use to convey whatever, right? They're not thinking that, but that's what they do. And so when I really intentionally structured my room around allowing more creative expression, that's when I was like, oh, okay, now I'm getting to like what's going on with these kids a little bit more. And I absolutely adjust my space to work with kids. There's some modalities like parent-child interaction therapy is a really strong evidence-based practice with kids, and you have to have very strict environments for that approach, right? One that I can't do at my practice because I don't have the type of room you need for that. But I'd say Black, like in, very concrete terms, having a couch and a chair and an Uno set and like Jenga, that's not conducive to really speaking the language of a child, right? And that book really speaks to like debate, like down to what types of toys are conducive to that and what maybe aren't.
I mean, I want to jump in here too and working with adolescents, because like I said, mine are at-risk youth. Some of them don't, well, most of them don't want to be seeing me at that moment. They don't, they're being forced. So they're resistant. And so I have found that the manipulatives, and the best one, and mark this down, folks, it's the Wheelo. It came out in the 60s, and it's just, so I wish I had it right here. It's a wire, and then it has a metal wheel that goes back and forth. And it's almost like an EMDR feeling, because they're watching the wheel go back and forth, and they play with that. That's the most played with toy that I have in my office, because of that move. I don't know if because of the movement, but they're fascinated. And you can get it for $3 at the dollar. It's just cheap. But nonetheless, it's the best, because the more they use that tool, the more they open up. They don't want to be there, but it's amazing how just watching that, the floodgates open and so much is revealed while they're playing with that toy. And also I think they pick it because they're teens and they don't play with toys. Some of it's that posturing as well, but that's my number one toy. And then I also have stuffed animals in my room. I know that sounds crazy, but they're all from the Winnie the Pooh. And so I might ask them which animal they relate to on that day. And these are teens, and they will just openly disclose what's going on with them as it relates to that stuffed animal. And these are teens. So what you do have in your office, Dr. Clark, is true. It really does help.
Well, and I think it also depends on the how much space you have, and certainly over the years of practice where I had one office, or even, I've done work as a school counselor at a private school, but I had one office. So I had some shelves with some toys, and I had some stuff with, so I think it's in space. But when I had my private practice, I had an adolescent room, I had a playroom, and I had a regular counseling room. I actually had a smaller playroom and then a bigger playroom that had more of like sand tray and stuff. And my adolescent room had a sand tray in it. So what I found is that we can't put kids in a box, because you could have you have a very parentified 6-year-old that comes in and wants to sit in the big office and sit there and talk to you like they're, 42, or you might have a 12-year-old that comes in that is really on the outside presenting like they're this tough, bad teen, and bad meaning cool, coming in. And then so I would say, hey, I'm just going to show you around the office. There's the bathroom. This is a room where we just have a couch and some chairs. This is a room that we have lots of toys. This is a room where you can kind of hang out. We've got some art stuff or whatever. Which room would you feel most comfortable being in? And I've had kids before adolescents that'll start off in the talk room, but then we're like, let's go in this room today. But I've even had kids that were like 12 that said, well, that looks kind of cool in there. And, that maybe really want that opportunity to be a child when they haven't had that opportunity. So I do think it depends on space. The other thing I was going to mention in terms of so when I have a playroom, my playroom is my playroom, and I don't change that environment unless a child has a problem with a particular toy. And I see this a lot of times with kids who've experienced trauma, that I have this 2-headed dinosaur, and it's a really great toy. I bought it I think Gary Landreth in one of his workshops recommended it, but I bought it at an Association for Play Therapy conference. But it's great because he's super mean and scary. But I have some kids that are like, I don't like him, he's scary. So I'll give them the opportunity to, what would you like to do with him? Would you like to put him out of the room? Would you like to put him away? But if they really don't want to see him, then I'll take certain things out that I feel like might be traumatizing. Or I have had some kids that, those little plastic swords can really do harm if those kids get in a sword fight with you. So I might take those out and just stick with Nerf ones.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I do some solution focused play therapy type methods where, it's very simply like exceptions and looking for that. Sometimes we will pick an item in our room that represents the thing, whatever the thing is, and then I'll put it outside the room and we'll say, let's put it out together, and then we'll play and we'll get into the session more, and then we'll notice what was it like to have the thing that represents that dog that bit you last week or that you're scared of. Let we put it out there. What's it like now, like what and it kind of depends on the age and what your goals are for therapy. But there's also, I have Legos that I'll use for Lego type therapy with some kids. Again, not just like let's build whatever, but I'll use that when it fits right for some of the kids, where they won't kind of fixate on it. But so some things I will bring in and then take out depending on what the goals are or the age or, what's going on. One thing I want to add to this too, as I mentioned, I do or have done a lot of research on what makes child counseling unique and competencies of child counselors. And for my dissertation research to start all this, I interviewed people across the country, people who have written textbooks about it, supervisors, play therapists, counselor educators, who all work with kids. And I asked a simple question, what makes child counseling unique? And what do you need to be able to do to work with kids? And one of the most agreed upon things that everyone said that was like 100% approval, agreed upon competency is to meet children where they are. And when you talk about that, it's like, speak their language, adapt, be creative. Don't be afraid to, I've worked with some kids who are nonverbal, right? They don't use words at all in sessions. So, okay, I meet them where they are. We don't use words. We use all sorts of things that aren't words. So you have to be willing to meet them where they are, right? And that's not just for kids, but I think it's especially true for kids. And this is what we're talking about with all these materials and the creative ways of doing it. That it all speaks to meet children where they are.
Well, and I think, Dr. Clark, that also is an important point, particularly with, it's also important to look at developmental considerations with children, because you may have a 14-year-old that comes into you that may have the cognitive development of a 5-year-old, so you have to be mindful, or you may have a 7-year-old that is gifted that might really be processing at formal operational level thought. So you've got to look at that. The other thing that went through my mind when you said that, Dr. Clark, was that, yes, meeting kids where they are. And like Dr. Erickson, you said, in working with court-ordered clients, those adolescents, and I've worked with court-ordered, from juvenile detention center and things, that don't want to be there. And they will test you and use profanity a lot of times to see if you'll, and, I had a client once that said, I just, and I was like, I sense that you're really pissed off. And that resonated with her.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. They do. They want to know that they can trust you. And especially with the at-risk youth that I work with, they've been let down by many of the adults in their lives. And so I think instinctively they push you away. At least mine do anyway. So it's really important to validate, and reflect what you see and support them throughout. Great point.
And mirroring that, giving them that safe space, whatever that means, that I'm not going to judge. I mean, I've had 4-year-olds I've had 4-year-olds that come in and they curse into the playroom. And one was a high conflict divorce, and Barbie and Ken on this side and Barbie and Ken on this side were duking it out. It's high conflict divorce. And the two Ken dolls said, one says, I'm going to kick your ass. And the other one says, I'm going to kick your ass. And the 4-year-old looks at me and I said, wow, looks like they're really mad. And he said, Dr. Ruth, you ain't nothing but a big old kid. but it gave him permission to use whatever at 4, to use whatever language he needed. And whether they're 14, 16, whatever age, that you can just give them permission to have that safe space.
And particularly with the at-risk youth that I work with, many of them, they don't have choice. And because they're mandated and they've wanted that. I mean, I go back to the reality theory, the 5 needs that we all need to have met to be happy, which is that safety and security, it's loving belonging, personal power, freedom, and then fun. And so when I'm working with the at-risk youth, many of them have wanted to have fun. Many of them want to exercise that personal power. They're not able to do that. So in session, it's so important to give them any opportunity to advocate for themselves and to have choice, however that looks. If it's talking to their parents or making a new decision, giving them that power to make those decisions for themselves. Often they'll defer to me. What do you think I should do? And my question always is, what do you think you should do? That's usually my question back to them, because they haven't been given that opportunity. They want it so badly. But so our sessions also center on just practicing that component and gaining confidence and just making simple decisions, whatever those decisions are.
I am incredibly late to the party because I had no internet for a little while, but there's something, Dr. Moore, that you said that I would certainly like to add to a little bit. And for all of you, hi, I'm Tiffany Rushwells, and I also work here in this department. And the things that I thought about are children who do have particular needs. One I'm thinking of had some learning issues, and the other one, I guess, also had learning issues in the other direction. And this one little boy was 6-7-year-old African-American boy who came in. He was pretty tough. He was going to be a linebacker, football, all this stuff, because he's like a man's man, even though he's in elementary school. But the only thing he wanted to do and needed permission to do so was play with the dollhouse. And what he liked to do was pull the dollhouse out, put little baby figures on top of it and throw them off. And it was really interesting because the reason this child came in for counseling was because he unfortunately was outside playing in the neighborhood. There was a guy who barricaded himself in the house. There was a dispute with him and the mother of his child. He had the baby and he actually threw the baby out the window. And while the baby did not die, this baby was severely injured. And this boy needed the space and the permission to have a safe place to reenact this over and over until he could somewhat make sense of it. So in that space, this child needed the support and the freedom to exercise what was really happening for him. And I allowed that. I didn't discourage him from throwing the baby off of the top of the house because he needed to make it make sense, even though it doesn't. Then my kid on the other end, who I'm currently seeing, is a very, very, very intelligent 7-year-old African-American girl who probably should be in graduate school right now. And the first thing that she let me know, she was really worried about her taxes this year. But her mom's a tax attorney, so she's hearing little bits and pieces and putting things together. But the big issue with school came in that she wants to do multiplication. And in her school, they're doing addition and subtraction at her age. And she didn't want to do addition and subtraction. She wants to do multiplication. No, she wants to do division. She doesn't even want to do multiplication. And they're telling her, no, this is what we're doing. So she says, okay, fine. 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times, and she went up to about 16. And they still came back to this child and said, no, we're doing multiplication, addition, subtraction, no multiplication or division. So she stood in the middle of her classroom and just screamed at the top of her lungs, and then they suspended her. But the thing that was interesting is she used the communication skills that she had. I tried to talk to you, you won't hear me, so I'm going to scream to stop everything. And she felt like she was punished, understandably so. But we have to work with this child because she is really, really intelligent, but she's still socially a 7-year-old kid, to be able to express herself and to get her needs met, and to also understand that sometimes the answer is no, but to be respected enough where maybe sometimes the answer can be yes. So children have such a range of abilities and such a range of needs that they express, but we have to be able to interpret and understand what they're trying to share with us so that we can meet them where they are.
Well, and I think that's a great point, Dr. Wilson. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about working with parents and helping parents understand. And, from an Illyrian perspective, I try to get them to understand the purpose of the behavior. It might not make sense to them or to like, why is this so important to her? But we have to understand that this behavior has a purpose and that we don't want to just punish this behavior. Oh, she's expelled or she's suspended, but in understanding why that's so meaningful to her. And, and a lot of times I get parents, it's like, did y'all forget that you were a kid once? Did you forget that you were a teenager once? And I see it a lot when parents will say, oh, she's got this boyfriend and she thinks she loves him and they're 14 and it's like, but when you're 14 developmentally, you really do believe that you love that person with all your heart. So the way you love your spouse is no different than the way she feels like at this stage of her development that she loves this individual. And it's getting them to understand and to think, outside of the rigid brain of, no, you will not do this, you will not see this, you will not do division, no, you will learn this. And being able to at least, you might have to say no, and she might have to follow certain protocol, but in at least validating her feelings, the child's perspective of that this is important and significant to you for whatever reason that may be.
You want the parents on your side. And sometimes with parents, they don't know what they don't know. And for me, it's important that they know that I see them as an expert in knowing their child. Because when I view them in that way, we become a team, and then we're better able to support their child. So sometimes there is a measure of psychoeducating the parents. And admittedly, in the beginning, when I first started out as a school counselor, thinking, oh my goodness, I have to talk with parents too, that was overwhelming. But you look at them as a client as well, because they have concerns and you listen to their concerns and also meet them where they are. So you can team up and help their child.
I always say, if you lose the parent, you lose the child. So no matter what the parent has done, no matter whether they've been abusive or anything, that you have to still validate their perspective. And like you said, Dr. Erickson, treat them as the expert, because if you alienate them or offend them or judge them in any way, they can pull, unless they're court ordered, they can pull the kid out of therapy, and then that's no good. The child loses.
Absolutely. I've seen that happen where I'll only involve one caregiver when there's a divorce situation, or I remember one client I was working with for a while, making good progress. It was early on in my career, and I didn't think to call the dad who lived a few hours away. And the dad was involved, just not living nearby. And a few months went by, and then I got this email. I don't even know how, but an email from a very angry dad saying, like, how dare you not even contact me? Technically in North Carolina, you actually don't have to, but it's good practice though. Like, and I didn't, and I lost it. The child before long basically was at a point where he was being told that counseling is bad, counseling's pointless by his dad, right? There was a lot of like negativity there. So even if he didn't pull him out, the child was like getting all these messages about how working with me was bad, right? Like, so it kind of made it really, really tough. I made it harder on myself to be an advocate for this child by not even trying to reach out to the other, right? And that's what I learned very early on, like I 100% agree. You don't work enough with the parents, you're going to lose the child. And it's some of the more complicated type sessions where you involve them directly, but some of the most powerful ones are that, right? To work in the system, because kids and teens operate in a system. It's not just them for all those hours in between sessions. So it's hard work and for me in a lot of ways, but it's very necessary work.
Dr. Clark, I'd like to add on to that a little bit too. I recently consulted with someone who had a really interesting case along those same lines you described, except it was handled a little more tragically, I guess, in some ways. This person works with an adolescent boy. The boy is from a state in New England. The other parent lives on the East Coast and the parents are going through a high conflict divorce. But the child really, really wanted to spend time with the parent on the East Coast. So the father allowed this child to stay with the mom, had to switch schools for the last couple of months of school. The person who consulted with me, because in the state where they are, the child is of age to make certain decisions for themselves, refused to contact the parent where the kid originally lived because they didn't really like this parent. They didn't like what they were hearing about the parent. So the parent did make a request a couple of times, and this person refused to talk to that other parent. So that parent actually filed an ethics complaint, and now it's a really, really big deal. So there's this huge investigation, and the takeaway is follow the contact an attorney, contact the ethics board when you have cases involving children where both parents actually have custody. If you don't know what to do, there are ways to find out information so that it does not escalate and create much, much bigger problems than you otherwise would have. So had this person really just found out between these two states, what do I need to do? And this kid is kind of living in some ways in both places. What is my responsibility as a clinician treating this under 18-year-old person? That would have helped them to avoid a whole lot of distress, and also would not have been so disruptive to this adolescent who now doesn't have access to their clinician.
Yeah, absolutely, Dr. Rush Wilson. Get copies of the custody order, right, or whatever legal paperwork they have in place, right, the emergency order, whatever it is. Don't assume that because one parent's bringing them that they're like, oh, we're good with the other parent or the another caregiver or whatever. You know, I can't stress that enough.
And document that you asked for the most current copy of any and all court orders, because sometimes parents will not be honest. And so let's say they went to court in 2021 and it was, yes, mom has sole decision-making power, but then in 2022, they went back to court and they have 50-50. And so she's saying, no, I don't have to have anyone else's permission for her to come to counseling here. And so you say, okay, well, they gave me the court order. You ask, is this the most recent? And I want the most recent copies of all court orders from whatever courts are involved, and document that. Because if it comes back and you go to court and they say, well, this isn't the most current court order, that you could say, well, I asked, who did you ask? I asked this person, and I documented that this is what was said to me. So, do be aware of all the players in the team. I don't want to say game, but it, sometimes with court, it does become sort of a who wins kind of thing.
Thank you. I do want to be respectful of time. We have about 4 minutes left. If anyone wants to contribute questions or comments for our wonderful panel, Dr. Rush Wilson, we're so glad you jumped in. We appreciate it. Please feel free to put them in the chat, or if you'd like to come off mute and ask them yourself, we would love to hear from you.
So there's a question about counseling adolescents whose values differ from their parents. Wow, that's like the next panel workshop for next year, right? That's a loaded. That is challenging. I've experienced that, especially around gender identity and sexual orientation issues. And then it gets into parental religious beliefs and all of those types of things. And it's really sticky, and I think it goes back to, for me, and I'll let the rest of you chime in, of trying to meet parents where they are, but also that psychoeducational piece of helping them understand like that the need to really validate this kid, because when you look at statistics of the likelihood of them engaging in suicide because of lack of support. I guess so briefly, because we're short on time, but just saying, for me, it would be psychoeducation, but meeting the parents where they are, trying to validate their perspectives, that where they are religiously, but then also educating them on what needs to happen with the adolescent in terms of being supported.
Right. I mean, I can think of an example too about that quickly. A client did not want to go to medical school. Their parents wanted them to go to med school and they did not want to. And so we worked together for them to be able to share with their parents really what they wanted to do, which was not that. And the parents met with me privately and they were so angry. How dare you go against what we're saying? And so through our conversations, they were able to understand that I didn't do that. I merely listened to what their child needed. And sometimes parents, I mean, we're all guilty of this. Sometimes you're just not really listening to what your child needs. And that's how it ended, that they were able to understand that, oh man, we're pushing our values on them. And that was a happy ending. But truly, what you said, Dr. Moore, you do have to be careful on how you psychoeducate them and bring them on board.
Yeah, I can think of so many examples of that complicated scenario where parents will tell me straight up at an intake, hey, you're not allowed to talk about this with them, right? Like they're doing this, don't explore that. Don't explore this thing that we heard they want to explore. And I'm like, wow, getting off on a good foot here. This is gonna be great, you know, and yeah. So, but I think it's important to try to work with the family unit that exists, right? Wherever it is, because the more you try to silo out these different interactions and emails with a caregiver and then have a session, like it doesn't work. So yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again so much. And we will hopefully see you tomorrow at our next sessions.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you.